KCDF podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Bhekinkosi Moyo. I'm happy today to be joined by Janet Mawiyoo. Janet is currently a lead consultant for Galvanising Africa. But really, I want to start, Janet, by welcoming you and thanking you for making the time.
Thank you.
I've been nagging you about this conversation. 17 years at the helm of KCDF, and in 2021 you stepped down. What would you say were the main successes in those 17 years?
Wow. That's a complicated or big question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. What were the main successes? I think first of all, it's a we, because we were many. There were many of us who did many things to bring whatever success we continue to observe in KCDF. And I'm thankful for that opportunity. I think we were successful in continuing to show that it is fundamental and critical to listen to ordinary people, ordinary communities, to be connected in a genuine way with them, and to really seek to be supportive of their efforts and where they want to go. So I think we remained faithful to that calling. I think we were also successful in building many organizations, many Kenyan ordinary organizations that are operating at different levels, that are tackling different challenges, some sectoral in nature, whether it is those working with girls, with women, with children, with boys, all sorts of diverse civil society organizations. I think we contributed to what they are becoming. I think we succeeded also in demonstrating it's possible to have an African organization that is well governed, that is well connected, and that is local. You don't have to be foreign to be accountable and to be contributing to making your country a better place. I think those are things that are clearly things that stand out. And we contributed in building the sector in that way. But we also contributed, I think, in showing it's possible to raise resources in the continent from individuals, from communities, from well-to-do people. It's possible to raise resources internationally and do what you need to do. And it's also possible to have a position. You don't have to sing a tune that doesn't make sense to you. So, these are very sort of top-level successes, and I'm sure there are many others. Yeah, and I'm not sure that I mentioned, it's possible to also begin and make some good steps in creating resources that allow you to be a bit independent. It's a life journey. I only must have contributed in getting that started and pushing us in that direction. But I honestly think we made some good steps in growing resources that the foundation will continue, because this is a lifetime journey and the problems kind of transform themselves in different ways as you move from maybe one year to another. So creating independent resources for our civil society organization in Africa is a very critical and important step. And I think we made that point, and the journey is still continuing. Yeah.
And you actually emphasized the we in the story of the Kenya Community Women Foundation, KCDF in short. Maybe we should go back and just pay some tribute to some of the people that came before you, because you took over from phenomenal people like Monica, Joyce, and others that were at the center of the, I would say, the development. So who is the we when you say the we in this context?
Yeah, that's very important. I was the second CEO, so I was not a founder.
Yeah.
I took over from Monica Motuku, who was the first CEO and did maybe 7 or 8 years or thereabout. And Monica was among those first founders of the foundation who together with others, mobilized to even just understand what was the problem. People like Dr. Joyce Malombe, people like Aleke Dondo, people like, there are quite a few people, Elkanah Odembo, etc. So those are, you know, among those very key founders, backed up by organizations that also believed in the same cause. So I think it was a combination of individuals, obviously, who sat together actually in homes, sat to figure out actually why is there so much money coming to the continent but not much to be seen for it. And in those conversations they figured that it was so important that they worked in a different way from the way the aid system was working. They found it was so important to listen to communities, to have like a bottom driven approach to development, to keep a long-term eye. So the question of sustainability remains intertwined in everything that the foundation was trying to do. And to seek to be relevant, to have a voice, to have an independent voice. And so that conversation, backed by others like the Aga Khan Foundation, the Ford Foundation, etc., you know, partners who also resonated with this way of thinking. I think that whole combination brought about the conviction that we needed to create a Kenyan foundation that would strive, would work with communities, and would also continue to create resources, or would work to create resources for its work, because you cannot always be given the money you want or the money you need for what your definition of the problem is. So that common way of thinking, of analysis, of understanding the challenges we were having in Kenya and continue to have is what brought about the establishment of the foundation. And so it was and has remained a collective effort. And so when Monica left and it was also my time to get back, and I found a resonance with this definition of the problem we were tackling. And so, I think all that is what all these many people working together, I think, is what brought about the establishment of KCDF, which continues to strive to make a difference, and in a sustainable way, in a way that is driven by the needs and the situation on the ground, not necessarily acting for anyone, but acting for communities, ordinary communities, and being, you know, acting as a voice and seeking to remain connected with that voice on the ground.
And of course, KCDF is unique in a way because generally community foundations are geographic specific, but in the case of KCDF, you took on a national geographic context. And the result, as we know today, is that you have now built in a community of about, if I'm not mistaken, is it about 27 organizations that are now working with KCDF, building their own mini foundation, endowments. Is it 27 or 21?
No, it's about 27.
It's about 27 now, right?
But those are the ones that are part of establishing their own endowments, which is being managed within KCDF. But we have had a countrywide approach. And I maybe just to comment a bit on that, because I like what I see in some of the developed countries, the idea of cities that have their own foundations, regions, and all that. But when you have a massive poverty problem, like we have had in a country like Kenya, you kind of have to think about how do you tackle this? If we just became a foundation for the city, but there are so many issues in the country that need attention. We didn't have the luxury. We needed to find an approach that would scale up the interventions that we were standing for and still stand for. And so the idea of a national, I think, came about because of and the problems are unique in the different areas. So how do you locate yourself in such a way that you can tackle any of the things that are being experienced in the country unless you become national? And you want to be representative of the different voices and issues, etc., and diversity.
I think that uniqueness is very important and is probably not that articulated for people looking into KCDF story, because I think if there's one thing that distinguishes it from other forms of community foundations, that it took on a national coverage, and like you said, you did not have the luxury to just choose the city that place and so forth and so on. So we'll probably come back to some of these issues, but I wanted to find out, before you joined KCDF, you were with Action Aid, right? Tanzania.
My last role.
Your last role, Tanzania.
Yeah.
How did that role and others prior to that prepare you for taking up this position at KCDF?
Yeah, actually, I think my getting to KCDF was like a journey that had history elsewhere, because I had actually spent some time in my very initial, after I left college, I did spend a few years working in government.
Yeah.
And at that point, I had already finished my first degree, and I was feeling the calling to kind of serve. And so when in my first years in government, I actually was exposed to different types of issues, social issues, because I had studied social work. But as time went by, I actually realized, I need to find a way for greater impact. But I was also concerned about the style we were working at when I was part of government. And I felt I wasn't being utilized. My skills were being under kind of not really used properly.
Yeah.
And I felt if I remain until I get comfortable with being sort of a lazy worker, then I'll be doomed. And that made me leave at some point and actually joined a bilateral organization. And I was comfortable for almost a year, but then because of political reasons, Kenya broke diplomatic ties with Norway. And my job and that of a few others was lost like at 1 p.m. news on television. And that was the end of it, because our president then, President Moyo, just said, no, we get out of Kenya. And when that happened, of course, we were jobless, but that, when I look back, was not a mistake. I was in a very comfortable job, etc. That in a few months, I was able to land a job in an international NGO, Action Aid to be specific. And I spent years now really getting grounded on what development was about. And then I began to realize how I was actually being wasteful and comfortable in my previous role in a bilateral organization. Those days, it was very hard to have the luxury of a desktop. It was desktop, not laptop. It was a desktop. But I was in a role where I had a desktop and whatever. But I actually developed my computer skills when I went to work for an international NGO. And we were on the ground doing participatory development with communities, visiting projects, understanding what are people experiencing. I was in that privileged position to really dirty my hands and I had a very good boss at the time. We did a lot of field work, and that actually grounded my understanding of development and connected me with people with many different needs. And later on, I moved on to do my master's. And actually, it was during the space in Action Aid that we realized one of the ways of scaling up the interventions was to have local grassroots-rooted organizations. And I then began to ask, how can you build genuine organizations on the ground? And that actually drew my interest in organization development. Because I actually managed to get an opportunity to do process consultation at that time. And that really also shaped my understanding of how do you help leaders grow, have good structures, run accountable organizations. So I was quite happy when I had an opportunity to do my master's, etc., that I could apply these skills in supporting other organizations, because within Action Aid, my last role, which was really effective or really grew me also, was to actually begin a department that was growing, local organizations, which eventually became the mainstream way of working for the organization at the time. So, it's how do you create scale-up opportunities? You need them everywhere. And the challenges in poverty, countries challenged by poverty, is that there are so many things going on at the same time, which show themselves in so many ways. So the interventions are many different things across. Later on, when I finished my master's, I felt that I needed to expand my understanding and took up a role in Tanzania. So again, I had the opportunity to be in a different context, very different dynamics. So when I look back, right from understanding the challenges experienced by communities in different places, to learning to work in growing other organizations, both in Kenya, in Tanzania, where I really also got involved in similar, realizing the role of changing or contributing towards working on policy, not just operations, but how do you change the environment? How do you create networks? How do you ride on any of these things to move some of the challenges that show up in the things that communities experience? You see, all those things, I think, shaped my understanding. And I think by the time I left Tanzania, I actually deliberately chose not to go to an international organization, because I had understood the limitations of being in an international setup. And I understood the politics and the money and everything. And I said, no, I'm not going. I'm not moving to be an expatriate again. I'm actually going back to Kenya, and I'm actually going to work for a Kenyan organization. Luckily, just about the time I was leaving Tanzania, KCDF was looking for an executive director, and that's how I landed in KCDF. So there was a fit, a personal fit of who I was, what I had experienced, what I had seen, and my desire to contribute towards changing the scenario that I had observed. And I felt I needed freedom from being held by the chains of the development system to one where I could have a bit more control and move the things I believed in, not just work for money, but work for things that I believed were important.
So there are so many themes that we could explore. So the first one, obviously, is fascinating that so many years back you were already looking at how to localize development. And it's only today that the big debates on shifting power, decolonizing aid and philanthropy are taking root. And yet you are saying here that you were doing this already so many years back. So that says something about the slow pace at which at times the architecture of aid and development as a way of slowing things, and also getting to talk about big issues at particular moments that could be of interest to powers that might be. But do you have any reflections looking back on the current debates around shifting power, decolonizing philanthropy, especially when you have the benefit of having tried to actually build a unit within an international organization to localize development?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost actually, since I stepped out of the international and went local, we probably are talking of 20 years type of thing after I moved, because it's 2 years since I left. So we're talking about 20 years. And me moving because I felt there was a need to do something different locally to drive our development as Africans. So I think when I listen to these debates and these conversations, even this morning, I was like, I think I've been there. I'm glad people are waking up. But I have lived this. I've experienced it. I have seen the way the things that actually perpetuate our disempowerment as Africans to change ourselves. So. And there is so much that actually happens that shapes you to want to continue to sing a certain tune, even when you don't believe it. But survival is such a big challenge. The survival of individuals, the survival of organizations. These are very powerful things which we can't ignore. And sometimes that has made me also have a personal reflection around how hard it must be for, if I may say, for women who are disadvantaged to survive, because that's the same dynamics. When you don't have the resources to do what you need to do, you are at the mercy. You are at the mercy of so many factors. And that really stops your own growth. And that's why the stories around liberation are important. The stories of how do we get ourselves, how do you empower people? And I think at the end of it, one of my big reflections continues to reaffirm that somehow we can't ignore the question of resources. Because resources speak. They make us do the things even when we don't believe them. And so we can't ignore. We can't ignore the importance of helping organizations grow to a point where they can stick to the agenda they want to. That's an important conversation. So how people are funding others, how people, the flexibility that donors are providing, the commitment to grow genuine organizations that are fighting or that are moving certain agendas. Growing the institution is just as important as the work on the ground. If you don't grow a good organization, the work on the ground will not be done. They will do your work, they're not doing the work that is responsive to the community. So in other words, you know, it continues to make me believe that we really have to grow serious organizations. We have to commit to growing the leaders, because organizations are driven by the leaders. And we have to address the question of resources. We have to, of course, address the question of who are we? What are we about? Why are we here? They may look like basic questions, but they're actually at the root of us changing this continent.
So then talk about organizational development. My goodness, I thought I knew KCDF until I went back sometime this year to update the case study that we had done on KCDF. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And everything goes back to you as the leader. So I want us to explore some of the pillars that you engaged in developing and growing KCDF. The first is the resourcing side of things. KCDF is one of the few institutions that has got a vibrant endowment. I say vibrant, not simply in terms of the size, but in terms of how it is constructed. And I've not come across any endowment that has been constructed the way yours has been constructed, where you've got the main endowment, but within the main endowment, you've got participating communities with their own endowments. What led to that kind of thinking? What led to that kind of, I would say, configuration of that endowment? Because it really is a fascinating way of looking at things and how communities can actually participate.
Yeah, I think it's back to the question of understanding your context. And having, right from the beginning, leaders, having recognized the importance of money, the importance of resources, the importance of long-term thinking. You may solve a problem today, but if tomorrow you are in the same problem, there's something that's not working. So longevity was an important thing to consider. And longevity meant we really had to think in this context where we don't have laid down clear legal requirements for an organization that is getting created, where there are no foundations. How do you register? And we, for quite a few years, from the beginning and even around the time I joined, 2004, the question of what is the framework that you use for holding this thing you're talking about, which is having a long-term view? Because it can see the work it's trying to do is long-term, it's not short-term. It is starting, but how do you create a firm foundation for that? So that was a big thing that we really needed to think through. And also another thing which was also very contextual was the fact that we were creating a foundation at a time when the trust of the people was very low in government, in big systems, corruption was rife. How do you create something that is credible? That was a huge consideration. So the context itself, where people are used to money being stolen, meant that we were like working against the wall. Because we needed to create something credible where people don't trust. And yet we had the indigenous way of living where we believed in Harambee, right from the first president. The idea of let everybody contribute what they have. We bring it together and we do the different things that are on our table. And yet they had also seen that money which is brought together sometimes being stolen. So really the issue of creating something credible, working in a way that continues to have the locals have faith in that system were huge considerations. And actually that is what led KCDF's governance and the leadership to say, it looks like we need an operating mechanism to be responsive to the communities we are dealing with. That became one entity, that became the foundation, and was registered in a way that allowed that flexibility to work with, you know, the people on the ground and be accountable without being held by the legal system. And actually that made KCDF not register in the typical NGO way of registering up to today, because we realized there are some difficulties when you are running within that. And many times we say, no, we are not an NGO, we are a foundation. And so that's an interesting area on its own. And yet we were saying we are having a long-term view, because our problems keep remaining. When, you know, every year there are many communities who are raising money for school fees, for example. There is we had orphans, especially from the HIV epidemic. How do you enable those children to live? And it's not one, it's not two, there are many. And every other time there's fundraising for this, fundraising the other. How do you deal with that unless you're thinking long-term? So the idea of how do you hold resources, and that led to the establishment of a trust. So that the trust becomes the holding vehicle for the resources that are for the vehicle. I mean for the foundation. Which would then be invested and then be fed back to the foundation for the work to be done. But moving on, then you realize you don't have the comfort of money. So you have to think, how else can you grow the resources? And everything is experiment. There's no script written anywhere. So of course we began to ask ourselves, even in our environment, what do people do? People invest in real estate, you know, they invest in land, they do things like that. And so in a sense, though a non-profit, we began to think almost like businesses. You know, we're committed to our cause, we began to think, I think we need to also consider, are there opportunities for us to invest? And, you know, I think our work by the 10th year or so of establishment, one of our partners decided to give us, you know, the building where we had an office, to transfer it to ourselves. And it was just a normal ground floor building. So of course, when we were thinking, what else can we do? We were like, we have this little place in about a quarter. Maybe we can change this and make it more than just our office. So again, trying to really put a business mind among non-profit leaders also was also another way. So I think there's something about the context, learning on your feet, being very agile, and of course we continue to ask that question, and I think that continues today. What else can we do to grow the resources we need to change the world that we are in? And that has led, I think, the foundation to invest and even consider creating a company. And actually now we do have a company as a separate entity, which has not been a straight route. It's been a long journey, long learning journey.
So if we look at the mechanics of the endowment, if we can just spend a few minutes on the endowment itself, before we get to the other, you know, investments. So if we look at the mechanics of the endowment itself, I mean, I was fascinated by the fact that you have this endowment, but in that endowment, you've got communities that have also created their own endowments. But it's managed by KCDF. And so when communities want money, they have to write legally to the trust and request. The same applies to KCDF. When it wants money, it writes to the trust and requests for funding. So that's one, which is on its own is fascinating, because most people, when looking from outside, we might just hear KCDF, but we may not know that actually there's a trust. There's also the new company that was recently established, but also within that you also have a fund manager, an investment manager. You also have a real estate, I think, manager, because you really wanted to do it in such a way that is professionally done by people who are competent in this thing. So as much as you are saying you were learning as you go, but you also were deliberate in making sure that you have the relevant instruments that connect the foundation and the trust, for example, that connect communities and the trust and the foundation, but also making sure that you hire competent people or institutions to manage that. Maybe just a few, points on that from your end, because you were actually the leader driving this.
Yeah. So I think we were very cognizant of the fact that we exist for communities. We don't exist for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that is our DNA, being responsive. So, and that the problems, our need for money was not unique to ourselves. Even the reason people are fundraising, doing harambes every day or every other day, is because they are trying to resolve issues. So we were not just trying to solve the problem of KCDF of resources, but how can we be relevant to communities? So we knew we are going to set up an endowment. But we also said the idea of dealing with the trust issues, we also wanted the communities to trust us so much that even them, they can also have pots of money that speak to the needs they are having.
Yeah.
So if your need is, for example, to create a fund for you to give the scholarships in the region where you are, or for maybe girls around where you are, because that's something that is really hurting you as a community, then we also said, by the way, you can ride on this structure because we have created a sound structure. And even to the relevant government of ministry, it is a community effort. So everything we are setting up is to enable KCDF to respond to the communities that are around. But we also want the communities to be able to ride on that. Now, the importance of that is we also would go back to the government and ask for a tax exemption, because there's nothing that is personal or for profit. So when the communities fundraise in different ways and bring their money to KCDF, when the yield happens, they are able to go back and do the particular thing. And we as KCDF must guarantee that the money that the different groups, and now there are 27 of them, is going exactly to meet to the needs. So we are custodian. We must be trustful. We must be accountable. It also meant this outfit has to be run in a professional manner.
Yeah.
We as a non-profit could not claim to do that. So we decided, what can we learn in our environment which can show how funds can be managed? And we actually learned from pension funds. Pension funds are managed by, fund managers. And so over time, we had one fund manager, and as the fund grew, we ended up with a second fund manager, because we also wanted it to be run competitively.
Yeah.
That's why you need more than one.
Yeah.
As the pot becomes bigger.
But one, they just put in one pot.
Exactly.
And,
but the trust also had to define what are the do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
So again, KCDF trustees had the importance of also giving guidance on such things. So you check on the fund managers, but you also give guidelines, because you don't want to also do anything that could be hurting. So by the way, there are things the fund managers cannot invest in.
Yeah.
So it was so important, and that's why the trustees, they make sure their money is safe. They meet on quarterly basis to hear the reports about how the fund is going. They hear arguments about they approve an investment policy.
Yeah.
They review the performance of the fund managers. They check for compliance to make sure that these guys have not invested this money in anything that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
For example, they don't invest in alcohol, because they are out there, they're trying to deal with drug abuse and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So making sure there's compliance to the policy that has been set is also important. And for that, it's better to make less money rather than contribute to a worse world than what. So there are principles and values and all that. So of course, the foundation then had to go and make this opportunity available to the communities, and different communities have come together and raised money. The foundation would support them to have ideas about how to raise money, so that even as KCDF strives to have money for its work, the communities also have a chance. And it also means it's very hard if the community, even if the community wants to raise money, how they never get to the Nairobi Stock Exchange?
Yeah.
By us putting together this vehicle, these communities become part of the investments in the Nairobi Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
So KCDF Trust becomes the vehicle for a lot of collective good, which is reaching very ordinary people.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that thinking was part of creating that structure.
And my understanding is some of the participating communities have been with the fund for at least 21 years now.
About that, yes. Yeah.
That's
actually, I don't remember even up to today any exit.
Yeah.
And it's not like we haven't had issues. Yeah, because by the way, I forgot to tell you, there is a fund manager, there is an administrator. Administrator runs the accounts of the investments, and there's a custodian. So it's a very complex structure, and I've never heard of such arrangements for the foundations in the US.
That's what I was saying. That is a very unique and it's maybe not complex, but well thought out mechanism. So talking of which, the endowment is not the only resource that you also went after. You also have a building now that is out in the market, generating income for you. You also had, investments through partnerships with Kagiso Trust, etc., etc. And again, what is it that you have learned out of that process? Because one thing that I also learned when I was at the building, I'm not talking about the building under the trust. I'm talking about the one that the office. So you actually have two buildings. You have the office, and then there's the actual commercial building, which is managed by the trust. And it was fascinating to me that when you look at the assets of KCDF, one could look at them from the perspective of the trust and not see what is happening on the foundation side. Or one could look at the foundation side and not know what is happening on the trust side. But when you put them, jointly, you realize what massive an institution this has become. So maybe we can talk a bit about the building, the partnership with Kagiso, and recently the creation of this new company. Is it called Adapo? Is it Adapo?
Yeah. You see, I think we try to remain as ordinary as possible. Just like every home requires a house or a home, KCDF as a long-term institution, because of the nature of things it is tackling, also required a home. And a home here, I'm saying an office.
Yeah.
So it's very hard when you look at how much money civil society spend on just having a space for their own operations. If you don't resolve that as a fundamental thing, then of course it means you're at the whims of funders.
Yeah.
Because one day they decide they're not giving you, when you are low, then you have to move from wherever you have been renting. So for me, any serious long-term organization needs to think about what can they have to ensure they can continue the work they need to do. And it was with that thinking that we struggled to figure out the need to purchase, not too much, just a space, which has become our point of operation. Yeah. And of course, we began by being at the little place where we had been given to operate from. But to develop another, we realized, to develop it and make that more economically viable, we realized we needed to find space. But in order to find an operating office, then we realized if we go and rent again, the money we are paying, you see, is so much that by the end of 2 years, when our process is over, we'll have spent. So one of the things I learned through that is, beyond being an NGO, sometimes you have to put a hat of a business person.
Yeah.
What you can do as a person, don't do it for a civil society organization, because it means it is bad business.
Yeah.
So when we counted what it would cost us, that money we realized is enough to get us 3/4 way paying for a space for an office. Yeah. So that in the end gave us an operating office. And I'm grateful that there was cognizance, there was alignment between management and the board in making these decisions.
Yeah.
then when we now looked at what we had been given, it's like the talent. We had just been given, an old office which was a refugee center, where refugees used to sleep. We renovated it, made it an office, used it for 10 years. But then we asked ourselves, how can you grow this gift that you are given? And we decided, when we looked at the developments in the area, we actually realized this can be turned into an office.
Yeah.
So that's when we now really struggled to figure out how to maximize. And that resulted in our building a 5-floor office block, which now we rent, and so that the rent becomes part of what comes back to the foundation. So that was a very challenging experience, one of my most challenging experiences. And while we were going through that process, I must say I learned a lot. And by the end of 2 years, when that property was ready, you actually realize that you have to think beyond being a non-profit, put a business hat. And when it was finished, of course, the question was, so how do you manage it? And before very long, we realized we were not in the business of running real estate.
Yeah.
There are people whose butter and bread is running real estate.
Yeah.
And that's why we quickly found a property manager, because we realized one of the things we have to guard against is having our energy sapped into the wrong thing, into the things that are money generating, and we forget that actually we are here for the people. So of course, finding specialists for each of these people has been a very important thing to go on. And I would say the third thing was learning from others. So luckily, as we were trying and continuing that journey of figuring out what else can we do to create resources, we came across Kagiso Trust, a South African-based trust, which was much older than us, but which had also gone through its own learning and struggles. And eventually they also found ways of raising other resources, raising resources to do the things they want to do.
Yeah.
So going into partnerships with another like-minded for learning purposes, I think gave us a kick in terms of learning, finding out, visiting them, checking what they experience, what challenges have they gone through. So we had a good relationship, and still do, with Kagiso Trust for learning from their experience. And I think what that did was to open us now beyond an endowment, beyond real estate in what we had done, to what else can we do? And from them we realized there are other ways of investing, creating companies, having a wing that just looks at building resources for the foundation. So that partnership, I think, led us to begin to explore alternative. And of course, it meant now we had to create a different vehicle. A different vehicle.
And that's how ADAPO comes into
That's
place.
how ADAPO came into the picture. Actually, at the beginning, we did something we were calling, or we still call Kenya KCDF Investment Holdings. And with time, we also began to learn the risk of having your brand in your private sector type of things, which is another story. And that is, with time, we actually then realized, oh, by the way, there are a couple of things going on here. So it's been organic. We have to manage the endowment, we have to manage and be accountable for the property, and now we are beginning to invest in other businesses of other people. So where can all this be coordinated and managed? That's what led to the development of ADAPO as a company to manage these investments on behalf of the trustees. Because we realized you needed something that is agile. And actually, in future, we are looking at ADAPO doing a bit more on the investment space, maybe getting into some other relationships with some other investors, so that can grow. But we are ever so cognizant of the fact that this investment side can be a challenging thing for a non-profit, and actually that's why we have now separated, so that all that is now handled by what is called ADAPO, and the foundation continues being focused on its work. So it's been a journey, an organic journey, a very challenging journey, but a very exciting thing. I've learned so much. I think at one time I knew in a sense, how to supervise a construction.
Right.
Because I would visit, I would be in meetings with architects, you know. Other times I'm sitting with fund managers and they're talking about what is working, what not. Be careful, elections are coming, the markets will go down. So I have learned so much by, you know, wearing different hats and sitting in different forums.
And which is why I keep saying we need to develop a module for non-profits. So a module that could realistically maybe be endowments and investments for non-profits. And we see how we can certify that. I think it would be very, very important for us to think about that. So as we begin to try and wrap or wind down, I wanted us to also talk a bit about governance, because I don't think you can do all of this without a governance framework that makes it work. And I know that that's one of the areas and topics of that is close to your heart, the issue of governance in non-profits. In your case, I mean, I went to the office and I saw the list of, you know, the former board members and the current board members, and I've had conversations with you on this and how you actually utilized each of those board members' competencies and experiences to actually help you to develop what you then developed. What would you say is the key thing that non-profits must really pay attention to when it comes to issues of governance?
Yeah, actually, for me, leadership and governance is at the heart.
Yeah.
You play around with that, you're going down. No two way about it. And of course, the thing, for me, the glue that runs across is actually the values that you have. Again, you don't have common values, you're gonna go down.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's what makes it a challenging thing, because it is not, it's something that you get to and you are done. It's a continuing process to continue to look for mission alignment, values alignment, finding people to serve in each of these things. And although you start as a non-profit, when you need business, but you're talking about business people or people who have that understanding, that knowledge, that expertise, who also share in who you are. Because fundamentally, you are a non-profit that is very community focused. So for me, whether we are talking about the directors at ADAPO, the trustees, the board of directors at KCDF, that the one thing that must run across and has continued to run across all of us is us believing in the mission of KCDF, and each one bringing what we have to push this agenda. So even when you are in ADAPO, you are investing. Yeah, you're talking about ethical investments, but you know you are investing because there's a child who needs to be in school. There's a policy that needs to change. So all that is so important. So I think finding people who have skills, the skills are just as important, but who are aligned to who you are, who share in your DNA, for me is fundamental. Yeah. And sometimes we want influential people, but sometimes influential people are not necessarily in the space where we are in. Yeah. So it's so important, I think, for any organization that it's better to take time, but to have people who are really aligned to who you are as an organization and where you're going. And then people are also ready to serve. And this is where now the other side of philanthropy. Because if most people, or rather they're in Africa, very often we are driven by what we get from boards, the benefits. Yeah. But this is one time when you are looking for board members who want to give back. They are giving back their expertise because of the difference it is making on the ground. Yeah. So you still need qualified people, ethical people, connection with the DNA of the organization, and that way then you are working towards the same goal. Yeah. And for me that is so important.
So it looks like we are back to the beginning with Janet now back to doing personal coaching, organizational development, and your current work now is really around that. So what is it that inspired you to after stepping down, going into coaching, but also wanting to do this work around organizational development through the Galvanizing Africa instrument?
Yeah, I think as I looked back at my life and what I had done, and I would leave it again, I was happy with the work that I had done over the years. I still felt that the problems haven't moved.
Yeah.
The need for leaders who are committed. Behind these organizations, there must be people. When there are no credible people, you have a problem.
Yeah.
But I also realized that I also led a tough life of learning and of stress, and many times unsupported. Very often, non-profits don't have the luxury of money. They don't have budgets to get a coach, you know. So I think the reflection on what my life had been and the fact that the needs are maybe even greater despite all these many years. You have all these people are working long hours, raising money, dealing with funders who don't always understand their situation. Then I was like, I think this is now the area I need to now focus on.
Yeah.
And I won't be tied to one organization because I didn't have a lot of time to really be available to others.
Yeah.
So I said, this is the time. So I actually, because of that, I then decided that I needed to polish myself as an officially certified coach so that I could be available to leaders in the sector who are going through a lot without people who understand. And since I've been there, I've been part of the warfare of leaders in the sector, then if I can contribute by supporting those who are there, that is one way of giving back.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also realized that there is need to bring the issues civil society experience to the forefront by having conversations at the right places, being available to support those who are going through those things. And I found sometimes there are also funders who actually want to know what they can do differently. And I have been in the INGO sector, I have been in the local sector. So I actually have a fairly good understanding of what's going on and where everybody is coming from, having lived it, you know. And KCDF globally, in a very small way, as a grant maker, I do understand the power grant makers have.
Yeah.
So I felt I'm in a situation where actually I can be of value to the sector just differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so for me, it is a continuing calling to be available to offer support to leaders who are leading, to organizations who are struggling with how do you create congruence within a board? How do you grow teams? How do you grow organizational culture that allows you to push and drive your mission? You know, and all this stuff. How do you manage change? There's so much going on for organizations. How do you build alternative resources?
Yeah.
A favorite of mine,
Yeah.
because I realize how important it is that organizations have alternative resources. So really, these are the things that I've felt I could contribute to the sector at the moment, and I'm grateful for the sort of opportunities I have continued to have. Yeah, so I feel it is they are needed in the society. We need to help bring what's going on the ground, who is funding, support the sector. So for me, it is continuing in just a different way, as opposed to being in one place. I'm a bit more available for more actors.
Yeah. And there's no doubt that, you know, in your current engagements, you are also going to leave some legacy, as you have done with KCDF. And I think it's really worthwhile to mention that you have also been recognized through several awards for the work that you have done. We have not really covered much ground in terms of the world journey that I know. I have known you for years and years. So one of the issues that we have not covered is your role in the African philanthropy space. You know, in the formation of the Africa Grantmakers Network and this evolution to the Africa Philanthropy Network. We have not spoken about you serving in Pan-African boards, you know, chairing the OSEA board, Trust Africas and others. We have not spoken about how you manage succession, which is one of the key challenges of institutions, how to hand over power from one person to the other. And so there's a lot that we have really not spoken about. But honestly, I want to thank you and KCDF, because the KCDF case study is one of the, you know, writings that we have done at the West Business School in CAPSI, which is used by almost each and every lecturer at CAPSI when they want to emphasize particular elements of philanthropy, whether it's sustainability, it's leadership, it's governance. All lecturers are using that case study. And we're at the verge of publishing it now with Emerald. Hopefully once it's published again, we'll be able to share those outcomes. But this particular podcast that we have just done, I'm telling you now, our students are going to be using it for teaching purposes as well. So thank you so much for really availing yourself. I'm hoping at some point we'll catch up again. I know we're talking about a book, so most of what we have not discussed might end up in the book. So thank you so much, Janet, for making the time.
Thank you too so much. My pleasure.
That was Janet Mawiyoo, currently the lead consultant on Galvanizing Africa, but former CEO of the Kenya Community Development Foundation, KCDF in short. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
You've been listening to the KAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.